want to, that this is against God, it's blasphemy, and he's going on about this. And Edward jumps all over him about being a coward and what good is your Christianity if you have no control over yourself. And they get into kind of a word thing going there. The outshot of it is that Jitsi decides, okay, he will come along, by golly. So they say, all right. So they move towards the ship, and Jitsi goes first. They push him up into the lift, and he goes up in the ship, and they come up after him. And there's poor Jitsi. He's just pale white, and he gets so sick he vomits, unfortunately, in a little bag that he has with him. And Ascot has to calm him down, and suddenly Jitsi remembers that he left all of his stuff back at his camp, and they let Jitsi go get his stuff and return, and then they take off. Well, they're in the ship, and they're getting ready to lift off from Earth again. Jitsi is still just pale white, doesn't know what to make of all of this. He's about 59 years old, by the way, and spent most all of his life studying the Bible, and now suddenly here's these people telling him that everything that he's learned so far is wrong, and it's making him ill. And this could be a very good example of what they're talking about. If the extraterrestrials were to suddenly make themselves well known and provide irrefutable proof that much of our belief structure is wrong, it can be very, seriously affecting on many people. It can make them ill in thought. It'll literally just drive people crazy, and that's exactly just about what's happening with Jitsi. And now they're in the 13th century. Edward's standing out on the ground, and he immediately starts to kind of notice nature all around him. First thing he notices is there is a larger abundance of birds and so forth in the air. The air itself is more cleaner. The oxygen content seems to be a little higher, cleaner, easier to breathe. You feel a little exhilarated, he said. And they're in France at the time of Louis the Saint, and they're going to visit a rabbi by the name of Jitsi. Also, the sky looked a little bit different in color. He remarked how the blueness of the sky was more blue and clearer and cleaner than he had seen it before. And he's still living in Switzerland in 1956, which is a pretty clean place. So going back several hundred years, before we started filling the air even with industrial pollution, things looked a little better. So they're somewhere in the woods in France, and Ascot leads them on, and they move through the forest a little way, and they come across this little house, and she's telling them that she's been here a couple of times before, and she has a friend here. And they're look around, there's a horse in the barn, and suddenly a bearded fellow comes out the front of the door, and it's Jitsi. And he's a real happy, friendly type people, and he's waving and so forth, and he comes over, and he's happy to see Ascot. Oh, hello, so nice of you to come again. And he says, are these your extraterrestrial friends? And Ascot says, no, these are Earth people just like yourself, but they're from the future. Well, this doesn't seem to shock Jitsi too much. He just kind of takes it in stride and comments that, oh, how wonderful, I wish just once that this beautiful lady would take me for a ride so I could experience some of this. But it isn't explained why Ascot has been there 2 times before, but apparently she has, for whatever reason, to see Jitsi. Jitsi is already known in the area as kind of a magician and a person who fools around with unusual things and so forth. So right away he notices Edward's lantern that he has with him, a little electric lantern with a light on it, and he asks him about what that is. So Edwards explained it to him. He says, well, no, it's not really like a lantern. It doesn't have a candle or a wick in it, and it doesn't run on kerosene or oil or whatever. It runs off of electricity. And he's showing him, and he pushes the button, and the light comes on, and Jitsi says, well, this is marvelous. This is wonderful. How does this thing work? And Jitsi remarks that he knows a little bit about electronics and would be happy to spend a few minutes explaining to Jitsi how the thing works. And they say, fine, you go ahead and do that, and Ascot and Edward wander off someplace else, and Jitsi and Jitsi are kind of hanging out together for a while, and they come back together in a few minutes, and Jitsi says, he asks Ascot, he says, listen, I've got some things here that belong to Jitsi that he gave me. Can I take them back with me? And she says, sure, I guess if you want to. And he says, this would be great. Then I would have like antiques from the 13th century France to be worth a lot of money. And Edward jumps on him again about being a materialist, and he says, oh, you're having this fascinating experience, and all you think about is making money. And they get into it again. So Ascot explains to Jitsi that, well, they really won't be antiques. I mean, they won't age, because once we get into the ship and go back, that there's no aging, that it'll only take a part second for us to return from where we are at back to 1956. So no aging will take time on this, whatever it is that you want to take back. Even though it was made here in this time, it won't show any age on it. If you really want it to age, she says, bury it somewhere here in France and then come back and get it when we get back. And then it would have aged, it's several hundred years' time since he buried it. So Jitsi understands that, but he takes the stuff with him anyway, and they leave the 13th century. It says in Edward's notes now that for the next 6 days, they travel to different time periods, they observe different parts of history, and each time they make one of these jumps and so forth to different time periods, Billy's starting to notice already this unusual feeling he has. Every time there's a jump, he somehow feels a little better. And he comments in his notes that there's a calming effect. He somehow feels a little better about himself, and he kind of uses the word like uplifting. You feel a betterment of yourself or something. Well, earlier we talked about the time when Billy got to go on the Great Spacer and experience eternity for 7 minutes. The same thing's happening here. He just hasn't quite picked up on it yet. But he's already sensing that just for the brief part second there, that your spirit is in touch with creation again when you're in the fine matter world. And there's this slight feeling of exhilaration that he can feel, which is apparently a surprise to the Pleiadians later on, because they say that most people can't feel that. They're not that sensitive to the sensitivity of creation as easily as Edward was. Well, one thing that starts to happen is they're going through all of these jumps over the next 6 days' time. Jitsi, who's still carrying his Bible along, is going through it all the time and making notes and changing things. And his opinion about religion and history is starting to change because he's seeing for himself historically what really happened as opposed to what's actually written down. And in most cases, in defense of the Bible, it appears that it was pretty much the same thing. There were just certain things that were, different here and there. And mainly the thing about Jesus Christ is becoming more apparent to him that it didn't actually happen exactly the way that Christianity has written it. And it's becoming more apparent to him all the time that the Jesus Christ never really did exist. Frankly, there never was a person named Jesus Christ. There was a man named Immanuel who lived the life and times that we hear was Jesus Christ. But it wasn't until the year 189 that they took the life, teachings, and times of this man named Immanuel, changed the name to Jesus Christ, meaning the Anointed One, and Christianity became alive. It was actually formed at that point. But there never was a man named Jesus Christ. That's just what it says now in the Bible, the way that we read it. But bear in mind, the Bible's been changed many times down through the years. One other comment is there, at some particular point, Billy seems to be wandering around in his thoughts about different things, and one of them was about the Great Pyramids of Egypt. And Ascot picks this up in his thoughts and tells Edward, I keep calling him Billy, tells Edward that I feel that you're curious about the pyramids. And she said, time-wise, they were built 73,300 years back from today. And they were built when the star sign of Lyra stood in Cancer. And they were actually built by the descendants, she says, of the Earth people, which would mean they were built by old Lyrians sometime back in there. Some descendants of the Lyrians built the pyramids. And by the way, there's, she says, all of the pyramids, because not only is there a great pyramid of Giza outside of Cairo, the one that we're familiar with, but there was also 2 other ones. And when they built them, they built 3. They built the large pyramid of Giza there. They also built one in China somewhere that's way below the surface of the ground, and it'd be a long time before we're able to ever detect it and understand that it's there. And then she remarked there was another one, and it doesn't say so in the notes, but Billy was telling me about it, and I'm not sure if he told me it was in South America or Central America, but there's another one somewhere in the southern part of the Americas that's just below the surface, where the very top of it, it's totally preserved below ground, and the top of the pyramid is just below the surface of the ground, and we should probably run across it most any time. We'll probably find it. She didn't want to elaborate at the time as to why the pyramids were built because, again, she felt this was going too far, that for the average person, it wasn't time to introduce knowledges to them about pyramid power. Now, there are many people over the years that have experimented in learning more and more about pyramid power, We are definitely to the point where we know there's something to it. People who have learned to meditate have learned the power of a pyramid, how it can block out outside forces and radiations, causing you to be able to concentrate better and raise your own awareness, your own consciousness. That certainly does work. But apparently, that the pyramids were also used for other things, for teleportation and protection and other things that they used. But she didn't want to take this much farther. But here we have some evidence that the pyramids, at least the Great Pyramid and two others just like it, were built a long time back, 73,300 years back actually. She said that the pyramids sat for a long period of time with no one really paying any attention to them after they were built. During the time of the Great Flood, which she says our modern scientists are off about 1,000 years on the time of it, that it was actually over 10,000 years back to the time of the Great Flood, 300 years previous to the time of the Great Flood, there was in the Egypt area, there where the pyramids are, there was a king named Saluk who had a son named Sarid, S-A-U-R-I-D, and his son Sarid had the gift of future vision and could easily see things coming to pass in the future. And at one point he saw a very destructive thing. He saw a great comet hit the earth, causing the earth to actually roll over, great storms, lots of water, where the ocean would jump out of its bed and roll over the land. And he saw his country land in Egypt buried in water. He told his father about this. His father, who was very aware of his future vision capabilities, called together other astrologers and scientific minds of his time to offer their opinion on what his son had seen. And they agreed that yes, and it would probably happen, and they felt very strongly, based on their abilities in astronomy, that there would be a large comet probably hit the earth about the time period that his son had set. So King Saluk ordered that the Great Pyramid begin to be prepared for the possibility of this catastrophe. And in so doing that, apparently they remodeled the pyramid again. I was told over at Billy's house that the pyramid originally had gold on it, that it was gold covered. Now what they did, the gold was gone apparently by this time and been stripped off by someone, we don't know who. And that King Saluk's people began to cover it with lime mortar, so it would be waterproof when the great floods came. Well, they did that. They even left inscriptions on the pyramid, so the people over the next 300 years would also know what was going to happen and what the pyramid was for. And at the time that the Great Flood actually happened, the people of Egypt actually did hide out inside the Great Pyramid, underground, in the underground city that had been dug out and built down below, where Billy's already visited. And they stayed down there until the waters receded. So the pyramid was actually used for that, and that's how it became covered with the limestone, and how it was remodeled over 10,000 years ago. It was stripped of its limestone later on, and it's been remodeled a couple of times apparently after that, but its origin was over 73,000 years back and had nothing to do with the Egyptians. The Egyptians, of which King Saluk was an Egyptian, was responsible for resurfacing and recoating it with limestone. Hence, this is probably where the idea that the Egyptians actually built it came from. They didn't really build it. They just kind of remodeled it. Another thing that Edward was thinking about was horses and animals, and she picked that out of his thoughts too, and commented that the horse did not originate in Europe, as modern scientists and archaeology think, but actually the horse originated on the continent of America. That there was, way back over 50,000 years ago, there was a large settlement of extraterrestrials, and this was the time period of Pleiadian, his people. They brought the horse to Earth, and because this was the continent that they lived on, that the horse then was very common and very popular on the American continent. The great wars that broke out later on and destructed that area, the horses on the American continent all disappeared, leaving the horses that were also in the European and Asian continent, leading archaeologists to believe that that's where the horse originated. But it didn't. It actually originated in America. And she said the horse back then was called a Hipparion, or Hyperion. I'm not sure exactly how it would be pronounced. It's Hipparion. She says, as evidence of some of the great wars and some of the very destructive devices that had been used by ETs in the past on Earth, we could look to Death Valley. That Death Valley was the scene of a great war at one time, where terrible weapons that dissolve things were used at that time.